we have the beginnings of what might look like a list of widgets, right? We're just displaying the text of this widget, right? What we'd like to be able to do perhaps is, depending on the type of the widget, maybe we want to render it as a paragraph, maybe we want to render it as a heading, right? How is it that we might want to do? Right. So and since we might have actually multiple types of widgets, and we might want to make this as generic as possible, so that perhaps we might have folks that can author any number of widgets, right? Right now we're just playing around with just 5 really simple, trivial widgets. But you could extrapolate this into some very complex widgets. Maybe you have a widget that allows you to create forms, right? Or a widget that can connect to a database, right? And hit a server and come back with data and gives you some grid representation of that, right? I mean, the sky's the limit of what these widgets might be, right? But we're starting off with some really, really trivial widgets, right? So for instance, let's we might want to instead of we could have here all sorts of logic inside of a function that determines what this should render like depending on the type. Yes, right? But instead of encoding it here, what we might want to do is have dedicated components that render different types of widgets. For instance, we might have here a JavaScript that renders heading widgets, right? A heading widget. Okay, and this might look something like import React from React, and here we have heading widget that takes as argument maybe the widget, and then it renders h3 heading widget, and we're going to export this, and this comes back as into the default as just heading widget. Okay. I'm just going to copy this, I'm going to paste it, and I'm going to call this the paragraph widget. Paragraph widget. And the paragraph widget, the only difference is that it will have here the name changes, so paragraph widget. And this says paragraph widget. Yes? Right? All right, so, and I guess I should spell this correctly. Paragraph widget. There we go. So now the list. Oh, I guess these should be components, not containers. Let me move that into the component. There we go. Now the top level widget list component. Depending on the type, it might render one thing or it might render something else. Yes, right. So for instance, what we might want to do here is the following. We might say, take a look at the type. Take a look at the type. Yes, and depending on that, if the type is equal to heading, so if that's true, we can put it in a Boolean expression that if both are true, then we have the rendering on the right-hand side. If the left-hand side is true, then we can render the right-hand side. We could render here on the right-hand side the heading widget. We can render the heading widget over here, right? And we can have here the other one, where if instead the type is paragraph, then we might render instead the paragraph widget. You see that? Right? So if we go back and do the rendering, notice that now, right? Notice that we're iterating over all the widgets, but the UL is either rendering one or the other depending on the type. See that? Right? So now what we could do is that we can leave the logic of whether we render the heading or we render the paragraph up to each one of the components. Right? Each component will know how to render itself. Right? So for instance, what we could do here is that in the heading widget, in both of these, we could pass down the widget, right, down to each one of these components, and then each one will know how to interpret the size, right, the text, the hyperlink, the video, the connection to the database, a two-dimensional array, whatever the data is, it will, each widget will know how to interpret its own schema. Make sense? All right, so let's do that next.